revealing the secrets of the most restricted place on the planet America. Boring history for sleep. Hey everyone tonight. We're drifting back to a place that's both very modern and, strangely, timeless. A place surrounded by desert, mystery, and more than a few bad PowerPoint slides. So, dim the lights, take a deep breath, and settle in. Because tonight, we're exploring the most restricted place on Earth. Area 51. Now, before you imagine little green men filing tax returns in Nevada, let's set the mood right. This isn't a story about UFOs. Not really. It's a story about people, about bureaucracy, about a handful of very tired men trying to build things that probably shouldn't have been airborne in the first place. And, like all good stories about America, it starts with paranoia, paperwork, and a lot of sand. The desert of secrets picture Nevada in the early 1950s. It's dry. It's hot. And the only thing moving across the landscape is the occasional tumbleweed and the sound of someone regretting every decision that led them here. The United States was deep into its Cold War era, a time when the word secret was practically a national hobby. Washington was buzzing with talk of Soviet spies, flying saucers, and atomic anything. If something could be made to explode, it was considered progress, and in this particular climate of "please don't nuke us," the government decided it needed a place where it could build and test experimental aircraft, somewhere remote, hidden, ideally with no witnesses who could say things like, "That flying triangle just set my cow on fire." Enter Groom Lake, a dried-up salt flat in southern Nevada. Surrounded by mountains and miles of nothing, it was perfect. No tourists, no towns, no one to ask questions, just a flat, endless expanse, and a single idea: build the impossible. Operation, something classified in 1955, a small group of people, scientists, engineers, and a few men with clearance levels so high they probably couldn't talk to themselves in the mirror, arrived at Groom Lake. Their mission? To build a plane that didn't exist. The CIA had a new project in mind, the Lockheed U-2 spy plane. It was designed to fly higher than any other aircraft, high enough to snoop over Soviet territory while pretending not to. And naturally, they couldn't just test it at the local airport. The average suburban resident tends to notice when a sleek silver needle shoots into the stratosphere at dawn. So, Groom Lake became home to this new top-secret experiment. The site was officially named Area 51, partly because it was just another section of the Nevada Test and Training Range, and partly because super-secret spy plane playground didn't fit well on government documents. Soon, barracks went up, a mess hall, a runway that stretched across the dry lake bed, and with that, a small population of engineers and pilots began their new life, commuting to work on government flights that technically didn't exist. The men who worked. There, let's drift for a moment into their daily lives. Imagine being one of the engineers assigned to Area 51 in the late 1950s. You're told to pack light, tell no one, and report to a classified airstrip in the middle of nowhere. Once there, you're living in trailers surrounded by desert and silence. You wake up before dawn, you eat powdered eggs, and you spend your day tweaking something made out of aluminum and hope. The desert air is filled with heat, jet fuel, and the vague scent of conspiracy. And every night, when the day's work ends, you can't tell your family where you've been. You can't even say you're in Nevada. Officially, you don't exist, which, for many, was fine. After all, this was the height of the Cold War, a time when being secretive made you feel patriotic, like a spy with a slide rule. Still, the boredom could get to you. Pilots were known to entertain themselves by giving nicknames to the scorpions outside, or inventing fake alien stories just to spook the new hires. And, as it turns out, those jokes would have consequences. The birth of the UFO legend because people started noticing. Local ranchers and small-town sheriffs began seeing strange lights darting across the desert night sky. Objects moving too fast, too high, and too silently to be ordinary planes. And, since the idea of secret spy aircraft wasn't exactly public knowledge, the only logical explanation was aliens. Reports flooded in. Newspapers ran headlines about mysterious saucers over Nevada. The Air Force politely pretended not to know anything. But behind the scenes, every single UFO sighting near Area 51 was, in fact, just a test flight. Usually a U-2 or later, the A-12 Oxcart, a plane so futuristic-looking it might as well have been designed by a child drawing a spaceship on a napkin. Ironically, the CIA found the UFO hysteria useful. It helped disguise the truth. If people thought the glowing object in the sky was an alien visitor, they weren't thinking about the classified hardware that was actually flying there. So, yes, the government didn't start the alien rumors, but they didn't exactly discourage them either. After all, we're building a secret Mach 3 reconnaissance aircraft is harder to laugh off than little green men are back again. Living in shadows by the 1960s, Area 51 had grown into a full-fledged base. It had its own security forces, known as the Camo Dudes, men whose job was to make sure you didn't get within binocular distance of anything. The airspace above the site became permanently restricted, marked on flight charts with ominous warnings. Even military pilots weren't allowed to enter. If you did, well, let's just say you'd be landing somewhere else for a very long conversation. The workers, meanwhile, were bussed or flown in on government-chartered planes. Unmarked, of course. To this day, a fleet of small white jets operates out of Las Vegas under the mysterious call sign Janet. They shuttle personnel back and forth between the city and Groom Lake every weekday morning, like the world's most classified commuter service. Life at the base was oddly domestic, though. There was a cafeteria, a small rec center, even the occasional movie night, when someone managed to get a reel cleared for screening. But mostly, it was isolation. Endless desert days, nights lit by test flights, and the constant hum of secrecy. And with secrecy came strange side effects, both literal and emotional. Some workers later reported respiratory issues, likely from exposure to experimental materials and fuels. But since everything was classified, medical complaints often went nowhere. You couldn't exactly file a workplace safety complaint about something that didn't officially exist. The next era, Blackbirds and beyond, as the U-2's missions continued. Technology advanced. By the early 1960s, Area 51 was testing its next creation, the A-12 Oxcart, later known as the SR-71 Blackbird. It could fly at 3 times the speed of sound and high enough to make even the clouds feel inadequate. The pilots who flew it wore pressure suits that made them look like astronauts, and each test flight required meticulous planning. If something went wrong, the desert often swallowed the evidence. Accidents did happen, but they were handled quietly. Wreckage recovered, reports buried. The outside world might hear about unidentified debris or a weather balloon. Because of course it was. Over time, other programs came and went. Stealth technology, drones, experimental fighters that never quite worked. Each one added another layer of mystery, and another excuse for anyone who saw something odd in the Nevada sky to whisper, "Aliens." The irony of the secret base. By the 1980s, Area 51 was both the worst-kept and most denied secret in the world. Everyone knew it existed. No one would admit it. Reporters tried to visit and were turned away by armed guards, conspiracy theorists, parked RVs on nearby hills to catch glimpses through telescopes. And every so often, someone would swear they'd seen non-human figures walking along the runways. In truth, they were probably just men in bulky flight suits. But imagination tends to fill in the rest. Finally, in 2013, nearly 6 decades after its founding, the U.S. government officially acknowledged Area 51's existence. Not the aliens, sadly, just the base, which, as you can imagine, was deeply disappointing to people who had spent years drawing diagrams of alien autopsy rooms. The CIA released documents confirming what historians already knew, that the site was used for U-2 and A-12 testing. Nothing more, nothing less. And yet, somehow, the legend didn't die. Because the truth, that it's just a dusty airfield full of overworked engineers, is much less exciting than the fantasy. The human side of secrecy. There's a strange sort of beauty to Area 51's story. It's that it shows how secrecy can build entire worlds of imagination. For the people who worked there, it was a place of pride, even if no one could ever thank them. For the public, it became a symbol of mystery, proof that the world still held secrets in the age of television. And for history, it's a reminder that the things we find most fascinating often begin as something deeply ordinary. Men in coveralls, blueprints, and coffee, cups, and a runway stretching endlessly into the desert. All too of it hidden beneath layers of dust, myth, and the occasional UFO headline. Let's drift, now, away from Nevada's shimmering heat, toward the next quiet oddity in American secrecy. Another place where power and paranoia found a permanent home. A place that, unlike Area 51, you could visit, but only if you didn't mind being watched by 1,600 security cameras. How did ordinary people survive the Black Death? Tonight, we're drifting back to the 14th century. A century of plagues, prayers, and poor personal hygiene. So, settle in, dim the lights, take a deep breath. Because tonight, we're visiting the world of the ordinary people who somehow managed to survive one of the worst disasters in history. Daituthivi, Black Death, a disease so terrifying that even the rats probably wanted to wash their hands, though tragically they didn't. We tend to think of the Black Death as a kind of instant apocalypse, a sudden wave of pestilence that swept across Europe and left nothing but bones behind. And yes, it was catastrophic, but it also lasted years, long, slow, bewildering years, and for many who lived through it, The real miracle wasn't dying quickly. It was figuring out how to keep living at all. So let's drift back to the year 1347. Europe is restless. The 100 Years' War is beginning. Trade is booming, and nobody has invented soap that works. Into this fragrant situation sails a fleet of Genoese ships, arriving in Sicily after a long journey from the Black Sea. On board, goods, spices, a few sailors who aren't feeling so well, and a generous supply of fleas. By the time anyone realizes the connection between those itchy little passengers and the people dropping dead, it's too late. The plague has landed. From Sicily, it spreads north to Italy, France, Spain, England. By 1351, it has touched almost every corner of Europe. Some towns vanish completely, others, miraculously, endure. And in those surviving towns, ordinary people wake up every morning to the same quiet question. What now? Let's start with a typical peasant village somewhere in rural England. Population, maybe 100 souls. If we're being generous, the air smells of smoke and wet hay. You've got thatched roofs, muddy lanes, and livestock with far too much personal freedom. When the plague arrives, it doesn't announce itself with drama. Maybe someone down the road gets a fever. A few days later, someone else complains of swellings in their armpits. By the end of the week, the church bell tolls more often than usual. At first, people assume it's just another bad year. They've seen disease before. Fevers, dysentery, leprosy. Life expectancy isn't exactly impressive. But soon, it becomes clear this is something different, something faster, something that makes even the priests nervous. So what did people do? They tried everything. And by everything, I mean everything. Some locked their doors and refused to let anyone in. The medieval version of quarantine. Others fled, hoping fresh air or new scenery might confuse the disease. And many, of course, turned to prayer. Religion was the first and last defense for most. The logic was simple. If the disease was sent by God, perhaps enough prayer could make him stop. Churches filled with desperate crowds. Priests marched through towns carrying relics. People whipped themselves in public squares, hoping to prove their piety through pain. They called themselves the flagellants. Bands of men and women walking from town to town, beating themselves bloody in hopes of cleansing sin from the world. Naturally, this didn't help, but it did spread the disease faster, so mission accomplished, in a way. Meanwhile, doctors, such as they were, tried to appear useful. Medieval medicine was based on the theory of the four humors: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. If you were sick, it was because one of these fluids had gotten uppity, so they prescribed bleeding, purging, or, occasionally, sitting near a pile of sweet-smelling herbs while someone burned incense nearby. You've probably seen the famous image of the plague doctor. The long-beaked mask, the black cloak, the stick for poking patients from a distance. It's iconic, but it actually came a bit later, during later plague waves in the 1600s. In the 1300s, doctors didn't have that kind of fashion sense yet. They mostly wore what everyone else did, just with extra terror in their eyes. Their advice, however, was memorable. One medical text from the time suggested that people should avoid bathing because, and I quote, "bathing opens the pores, allowing bad air to enter." So yes, hygiene got even worse during the plague, because of course it did. Now, let's step into a medieval city, say Florence or London. The streets are narrow, the air thick with smoke and fear. Merchants close their shops. Servants disappear. Bodies pile up faster than anyone can bury them. In Florence, chroniclers reported that family members abandoned each other, parents leaving children, wives leaving husbands, and yet not everyone ran. Some people stayed to help. Gravediggers, nurses, monks, nuns, the unsung survivors who kept the dead from overwhelming the living. In London, carts creaked through the streets at dawn, carrying corpses to mass graves. "Bring out your dead," they called, or so later writers claimed. Reality was probably quieter, sadder. A few men, faces wrapped in cloth, doing their grim work as the city watched through shuttered windows, and yet life went on. Markets reopened. Bakers baked. Children played. Because no matter how terrifying the world became, people still needed bread. There's something strangely touching about that. The sheer ordinariness that persisted. Even in the middle of horror, people kept routines. They lit candles, fed their animals, argued with their neighbors. Small acts of normalcy in a collapsing world. That, in a way, was survival. Not through heroism or medical knowledge, but through stubborn, almost unconscious persistence. Of course, not everyone believed the plague was natural. Medieval Europe loved a good conspiracy. Some blamed witches, others the alignment of planets, and tragically, many blamed Jewish communities, accusing them of poisoning wells. It was absurd and deadly. Pogroms swept across parts of Europe. Thousands of Jews were killed, driven out, or forced to convert. Because when faced with something they couldn't understand, people did what they often do. They found someone to blame. And while those atrocities unfolded, the plague simply kept spreading, unimpressed by superstition, unmoved by vengeance. So, who did survive? Some simply got lucky. Perhaps they had a bit of immunity, or the local rats died off first, breaking the chain of infection. Others benefited from geography. Isolated villages, mountain towns, or islands sometimes escaped the worst. In a few rare cases, quick thinking helped. Records from the city of Milan suggest that when plague struck, officials sealed entire houses where victims lived, boarding them up with food and water, leaving the sick inside until the disease burned itself out. Horrific, yes, but apparently effective. Milan lost far fewer people than neighboring cities. Venice, ever the organized trading republic, began enforcing maritime quarantines, the origin of the word itself, 40 giorni, or 40 days. Ships arriving from infected ports were made to wait offshore for 40 days before unloading cargo or crew. It wasn't perfect, but it was the beginning of modern public health. Meanwhile, out in the countryside, survival meant adaptation. When whole families died, the survivors simply moved into their houses. Abandoned farms were reclaimed. Fields were plowed again by whoever was left. The plague destroyed communities, but it also, strangely, reshaped them. After the first great wave, labor became scarce. Workers suddenly had leverage. A peasant who survived could demand better wages, better conditions, or simply leave to find a lord who would pay more. In the long run, that shift helped weaken the old feudal system. In the short run, it annoyed the nobility immensely. By the 1350s, new laws popped up across Europe trying to freeze wages and force peasants back to their pre-plague status. Naturally, that didn't go well. People who had faced down death were not easily intimidated by paperwork. So, in a strange, ironic twist, the Black Death, that silent, merciless killer, ended up empowering the survivors. It made ordinary people just a little less powerless. Let's pause there for a moment. Imagine you're one of them, an ordinary villager who somehow made it through. Darid Fido! Bells have stopped ringing. The air smells of earth again. You're alive. Maybe your family isn't. Maybe your village feels emptier than it used to, but the wheat still grows, the sun still rises, and you keep going. Because what else is there to do? That quiet endurance, that instinct to keep living amid loss. It's what defines the survivors of the Black Death far more than fear or faith ever did. In the centuries that followed, the plague returned again and again. Waves in the 1360s, the 1400s, the 1600s. Each time, humanity flinched, adapted, and carried on. Because that's what we do. We survive, even when survival feels impossible. And somehow, out of all that darkness came something unexpected. A transformation. The world that emerged after the plague was not the same as the one before. Wages rose. Cities changed. Art, science, and even hygiene eventually began to evolve. The old medieval order cracked, and through those cracks, something modern began to grow. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. Let's drift there slowly, because in the next part, we'll wander deeper into the strange world of medieval medicine. The doctors who swore onions could cure the plague, the herbs and charms people trusted with their lives, and the quiet resilience that kept ordinary people alive through sheer hope and habit. In the next part, we'll drift deeper into how executioners became folk healers, graveyard entrepreneurs, and sometimes reluctant local legends. Before the graveyards tonight, we're drifting back to a time before cemeteries, before tidy rows of marble markers, before the gentle sound of church bells on Sunday mornings. Tonight, we're going somewhere much quieter, much older, and, if we're being honest, much less hygienic. Because long before the word cemetery existed, people still had the same problem they do now. What to do when someone stopped being, well, alive. And while you might think the answer was obvious, bury them. Well, it wasn't. For most of human history, burial was just one of many competing ideas. Sometimes the goal was spiritual purity, sometimes sanitation, and sometimes it was just convenience. So let's drift back, way back, to the earliest traces of humanity, to the people who lived, died, and left us the first evidence of what it meant to care for the dead. The oldest burials we know of date back more than 100,000 years, long before cities, before writing, before anyone could even spell rest in peace. The Neanderthals were already laying their dead in shallow graves, sprinkling the bodies with red ochre, a pigment the color of blood. Some archaeologists think it was symbolic, a gesture of life returning to the earth. Others think it was purely practical, a way to cover up the smell before hyenas arrived. Both explanations are equally human, and honestly, it sets the tone for everything that comes next. Because the history of body disposal is really a history of how we balance two instincts, reverence and revulsion. We want to honor the dead, but also to make sure they stay put. Let's drift to ancient Mesopotamia. The first real cities, mud brick houses, narrow alleys, and very limited trash collection. Here, the dead were often buried under the house, literally beneath the living room floor. Family members would place their relatives in clay coffins, seal them, and bury them beneath the packed dirt where they continued to live, eat, and sleep, which is oddly intimate when you think about it. Dinner with the ancestors every night. But it also meant the family could still visit them, pour libations through small holes in the floor, offer bread and oil to the deceased, because in Mesopotamian religion, the dead didn't really leave. They just lived somewhere slightly worse. The underworld, known as Irkalla, wasn't a place of punishment or paradise. It was just eternal bureaucracy, gray, dusty, and mildly depressing. like spending forever in the waiting room of a very unmotivated government office. So people wanted to keep their loved ones close, just in case the afterlife turned out to be as boring as advertised. The Egyptians, on the other hand, went in the opposite direction. They didn't bury the dead under their homes. They built entire civilizations around not burying them properly. The earliest Egyptians discovered, quite by accident, that the desert could preserve a body beautifully. If you wrapped it lightly and left it in dry sand, it would desiccate instead of rot. And so the idea of eternal preservation, of mummification, was born. Over thousands of years, this turned into a highly organized system of spiritual embalming. Organs were removed, dried, and stored in little jars. The heart, believed to be the seat of the soul, was usually left in place, and the brain, considered useless, was scooped out through the nose with a hook, because, naturally, someone decided that was the best method. Now, we often think of mummification as glamorous. Gold masks, sarcophagi, pyramids, but in truth, it started as a practical problem. How do you stop a body from decaying long enough to keep it holy? And it didn't end with pharaohs. For much of Egyptian history, even modest families tried to preserve their dead as best they could. Sometimes that meant a bit of linen, some oils, and a lot of wishful thinking. The desert helped. So did denial. But at least it kept the neighbors from complaining. Meanwhile, across the Mediterranean, the Greeks had their own approach: fire. Cremation wasn't just practical, it was philosophical. They believed the body was a temporary vessel. What mattered was the soul, and flame was its release. Funeral pyres were common by the 8th century BCE. The ashes were collected, placed in urns, and buried with a few offerings, perhaps a cup, a comb, or a coin for Charon, the ferryman of the underworld. In Homer's Iliad, entire armies stopped mid-war to perform elaborate cremations. Even in battle, death required ceremony. And while the Greeks liked their pyres tidy and solemn, the Romans, predictably, industrialized the process. They built large cremation grounds outside city walls, known as ostrina, where bodies could be burned efficiently, often several a day, because nothing says civic order quite like scheduled immolation. By the way, that outside the walls part was important. For centuries, it was illegal to bury or burn a body inside city limits. Romans were practical about many things, and urban sanitation was one of them. They liked their gods close, but not that close. So cemeteries, when they did exist, were located along the roads leading out of the city. You can still see them today. The famous Appian Way, lined with tombs and sarcophagi. It's a strangely poetic idea. The road for the living, flanked by the homes of the dead. But what about people who weren't rich, or noble, or important enough for a monument? Well, that's where things get a bit grim. In ancient cities, poor people often had no formal burial at all. Bodies might be placed in mass graves, tossed into pits, or left for animals. Sometimes slaves or criminals were buried in the same ditches as garbage. In Athens, the Kerameikos served as both a pottery district and a burial ground, two trades united by dust. And in Rome, the Puticuli, literally stinking pits, were massive open graves outside the city where the poor and enslaved were dumped. Isatsiti, Roman poet, once complained that the smell from those pits reached even the gardens of the rich, which, in a way, was probably the closest thing to social equality the ancient world ever achieved. Now, before we drift too deep into despair, it's worth noting that not all pre-cemetery cultures were so bleak. In Iron Age Europe, Hradomidkij, Pantrefid, the Celts treated burial as an art form. They buried their dead with feasts, weapons, jewelry, and occasionally entire chariots. It was like sending someone off to the afterlife with all their favorite accessories. One famous burial at Hochdorf in modern Germany included a 6-foot-tall bronze couch, 9 drinking horns, and a cauldron that could hold 400 liters of mead. A funeral and a party, all in one. Death, for them, wasn't an ending. It was a continuation, and apparently a pretty festive one. Now, let's drift forward a little, to the Middle Ages. By this point, Christianity had spread across Europe, and with it came a profound shift in how people thought about the dead. Bodies weren't just mortal remains anymore. They were sacred vessels, temporary, resting places for souls awaiting resurrection, which made disposal complicated. Cremation was out. It was seen as pagan, even heretical. Because how could you rise from the dead if your body had been turned to ash? So burial became the rule. But where to bury? The answer naturally was, everywhere you shouldn't. For most of the early Middle Ages, people were buried in and around churches, sometimes in the courtyard, sometimes literally beneath the floor. The holier the ground, the better your afterlife prospects. And so, by the 12th century, every churchyard in Europe was crammed with bodies, layers upon layers of them. Some places had so little room left that grave diggers simply rotated the soil. Old bones were gathered up and stacked in charnel houses. New bodies were placed in the refreshed earth. It was a sort of medieval composting system. Efficient, if a bit unsettling. The smell, according to contemporary records, was pious but strong, which is a very charitable way to describe what was essentially the aroma of mass decomposition. Now, you might be wondering, why didn't anyone just build new burial grounds farther away? Well, they eventually did, but not until things got truly unpleasant. In 12th century Paris, for example, The Church of the Holy Innocents became the city's primary burial ground. It was used for everyone: nobles, commoners, plague victims, and occasionally whatever the river dragged in. For centuries, bodies were piled there in open pits. By the 18th century, the ground level had risen several meters from the sheer volume of corpses. Locals complained that the smell made bread in nearby bakeries go sour, which, honestly, feels like an early sign that something had gone wrong. Eventually, of course, they decided to fix it by moving all the bones into the Paris catacombs. But that's a much later chapter. For now, in our medieval world, death was still something kept close, sacred, familiar, and a little bit crowded. So before cemeteries, before tidy lawns and carved headstones, people had an astonishing variety of ways to care for the dead. They buried them under houses. They burned them on hillsides. They left them to the elements. They stacked them beneath churches. And through it all, one constant remained: the desire to make sense of death, to honor what was left behind, and to keep it from interfering with dinner. Because, really, that's the delicate balance of human civilization, between memory and hygiene. In our next drift, we'll wander into the transitional era, from the plague pits of the Middle Ages to the rise of organized graveyards and the strange social etiquette of being buried near saints, because, as it turns out, cemeteries didn't appear all at once. They evolved slowly, one overcrowded churchyard at a time. Let's take a deep breath. The lonely retirement of the hangman tonight. We're drifting back to a time when justice was a public event, when the word execution didn't mean a bureaucratic formality behind closed doors, but an all-day spectacle, ideally with snacks. So, if you're settling in for the night, maybe your blanket's tucked just right, maybe your cat's staring at you with quiet judgment, let's drift into the strange, uncomfortable world of the medieval executioner. Because while kings and queens had the luxury of dying dramatically, poisoned, beheaded, or, if they were really lucky, exiled somewhere scenic, executioners had the unique burden of being the ones who made that happen. And when they finally put down their axe or rope, well, society didn't exactly throw them a retirement party. Let's start with the basics. The job of an executioner was, in most cases, inherited. That's right, a family business. A deeply awkward one, where your father's proudest legacy was that he could decapitate a man in 2 swings instead of 4. In many parts of Europe, Germany, France, and the Holy Roman Empire especially, executioners formed little dynasties. The same family would run the gallows for generations, like a macabre guild. You might know the Smiths for being blacksmiths, the Bakers for baking, and the Frances for dismembering people on Thursdays. And because everyone needed someone to do it, but no one wanted to touch them, These families lived a strange dual life, feared, necessary, and utterly untouchable. You might think that, when they retired, they'd finally get some peace. But the problem was, nobody wanted to live next door to an ex-executioner. After all, how do you invite someone like that to dinner? Please pass the salt, and try not to think about the last neck you saw. In most towns, executioners were legally required to live outside the city walls. Sometimes they were given a cottage on the edge of town, close enough to be summoned for work, but far enough to keep the neighbors from complaining about the stench of death, as one 15th century record politely put it. They couldn't attend church with everyone else. They couldn't marry respectable women. Their children often couldn't get apprenticeships or guild work unless they became executioners too. And when they did retire, they didn't get pensions, medals, or letters of thanks. Instead, they were often quietly told to keep living on the margins, as if society had no idea what to do with them now that they weren't actively swinging the sword. In Nuremberg, for instance, executioners had their own tavern, but not because anyone wanted to drink with them. It was because no one else would serve them. They were considered dishonorable tradesmen. That same category included grave diggers, knackers, the people who disposed of dead animals, and prostitutes. A charming social club, really. It's one of the great ironies of medieval morality. Everyone wanted justice, but nobody wanted to stand next to the man who provided it. Now, here's the twist, and medieval history always has one. Executioners were actually very well paid. In some cities, they earned more than the mayor. They were given free housing, meat from condemned animals, and even the right to sell leftover clothing from their victims, which sounds morbid, but in the Middle Ages, recycling was very in. The problem was, they couldn't spend their money anywhere respectable. Taverns wouldn't serve them, churches wouldn't bless them, and if they tried to move to another town to start fresh, people would literally throw stones at their door. So, what did they do? Well, some reinvented themselves as healers. It sounds strange, but it's true. Executioners often became unofficial doctors. They knew anatomy better than anyone, sometimes too well, and they had access to things most doctors didn't, like human fat. Yes, human fat was a prized ingredient in medieval medicine. It was used in balms and salves to treat everything from arthritis to bruises. Executioners, being the suppliers of fresh corpses, had a convenient monopoly on the product. They were also trusted to handle wounds, set bones, and even perform minor surgeries. The logic was simple. If you can cut a man's head off cleanly, surely you can remove a boil. In some German towns, executioners were officially licensed as both public healers and public punishers, two jobs that, one assumes, they tried to keep very separate. There's a famous example from 16th century Nuremberg. Franz Schmidt, perhaps the most famous executioner in history. Franz was a model of professionalism. He kept detailed journals of every execution he performed, over 350 in total, as well as countless whippings, brandings, and amputations. His handwriting was neat. His notes were clinical. He rarely expressed emotion, though occasionally a hint of pity slipped through. And after decades of service, do you know what he did when he retired? He became a doctor. Franz was granted legal permission by the city council to practice medicine, something that no other executioner had ever been allowed to do. He treated the poor for free and the rich for a modest fee. And remarkably, people came to him in droves because, despite the stigma, he was good. His understanding of the human body and how to keep it alive or not made him one of the most effective healers in the region. It's a strange redemption arc, but perhaps a fitting one. A man who had spent a lifetime mastering death ended his days preserving life instead. But of course, not all executioners got such a dignified ending. Some drank themselves to ruin. Others were killed by mobs, especially during uprisings, when the executioner was often the first target, and a few tried to fade into obscurity, which was easier said than done when everyone in town knew your face. One account from France tells of an executioner who retired and tried to become a farmer. The villagers refused to buy his crops. They claimed the soil was cursed by all the blood he had spilled. He died penniless, and his fields were left to rot. It's poetic, in a bleak kind of way. You spend your life cleaning society's conscience, and society thanks you by pretending you never existed. And yet, there's another side to it. Some executioners took a quiet pride in their work. They saw themselves not as killers, but as instruments of justice, the ones who kept chaos at bay. Many wrote or commissioned their own epitaphs, small, carved apologies to God. Franz Schmidt's tombstone still reads, "God be merciful to me, a poor sinner." No mention of his profession, just a man hoping for peace. Let's drift over now to what retirement really meant for such men. There was no gold watch, no pension, no gentle transition. Usually, retirement came because they could no longer hold the sword steady. Age, tremors, or guilt, whichever came first. A few trained their sons to replace them. A few simply stopped showing up to the scaffold. And in many cases, the city quietly replaced them and looked the other way. Sometimes they'd still be called upon in emergencies, like when the new executioner was sick, or incompetent, or both. Imagine being pulled out of bed at 70 years old because the younger guy missed his mark. There's a melancholy humor in that The idea that, even in retirement, the hangman was never quite done. It's easy to forget that these men lived in constant tension with their own humanity. They were required to attend church, but not too close to the altar. They were expected to act mercifully, but also decisively. And they were feared for doing exactly what they were paid to do. A 14th century priest once wrote, "The hangman's hand is both cursed and blessed, cursed by men, blessed by God, for he alone delivers justice." A comforting thought, if you happen to be the hangman. By the end of their lives, most executioners had developed a kind of stoic detachment. Not cruel, necessarily, just numb. Franz Schmidt once recorded that after his first execution, he could not eat for 3 days. By his 20th, he had dinner afterward. The body adapts. The mind dulls. And somewhere in that numbness, life goes on. When those men finally hung up their sword, or axe, or rope, they often lived quietly, tending gardens, keeping chickens, sometimes even marrying late in life. One executioner in Austria became a beekeeper. He said the bees didn't care about his past. It's a small mercy. As the years rolled on, the profession began to fade. By the 18th century, many European cities had formalized justice systems, professional guards, and private executions. The public theater of punishment was dying out, and with it, the executioner's grim celebrity. Some families changed their names to escape the legacy. Others emigrated, blending into anonymity. But for centuries, the shadow of that work, that necessary, shameful labor, clung to their descendants. In one case, a German executioner's great-grandson became a priest. When asked about his family history, he simply said, "We cut souls free instead of bodies now." A poetic rebranding, if nothing else. So, when we ask what happened to medieval executioners after they retired, the answer is, mostly, nothing. They drifted quietly into obscurity, half feared, half forgiven, living out their days in the uneasy peace between duty and exile. It's one of history's quieter ironies, that the men who made death look effortless were the ones never allowed to live normally. And maybe that's the most medieval thing of all. Everyone wanted justice. No one wanted to get their hands dirty. So someone else did it, and was never allowed to wash them clean. The air's a bit musty, full of incense and history. And when you're ready, we'll continue. The churchyard problem. What did queens do all day in the Middle Ages? Tonight, we're drifting back to a quieter time. A time of cold castles, smoky hearths, and women who technically ruled kingdoms, but couldn't open a window without permission. So get comfortable. Dim the lights. Maybe pull your blanket a little closer, because we're about to spend the evening in the company of medieval queens, women who had everything except freedom. Gold, gowns, servants, palaces, and absolutely no privacy. A life that looked glamorous from a distance, but up close felt mostly like very expensive boredom. So tonight, we're asking the question, what did queens actually do all day in the Middle Ages? Spoiler, mostly embroidery, diplomacy, and waiting for their husbands to notice them. Let's start with the setting. Forget the gleaming marble palaces of later centuries. Medieval queens lived in castles. And castles, despite what movies suggest, were not cozy. They were cold, damp, and smelled faintly of wet dog, smoke, and boiled cabbage. Windows were small, fires smoked constantly, and the furniture was mostly designed to survive sieges rather than to be comfortable. If you were lucky, your bed had curtains, not for luxury, but to block the drafts and occasionally the rats. Every morning began early. Not because queens were particularly motivated, but because light was precious. Once the sun was up, servants bustled in to start the daily ritual of dressing. And dressing a queen was an event in itself. There were layers of linen, wool and silk, undergarments tied with cords, gowns laced from the back, and sometimes belts heavy enough to double as small weapons. Jewels were added last, crowns or circlets for formal occasions, veils and hoods for everything else. By the time she was ready, an hour had already passed. Not that she was going anywhere. The medieval queen's schedule revolved around one word: duty. Everything. What she ate, who she spoke to, how she walked, reflected on the monarchy. She was both person and symbol, wife and public artwork. A queen's main job, of course, was to produce heirs, preferably male ones, preferably healthy, preferably without dying in the process, though that part was negotiable. Once married, her body became political property. Letters between kings often referred to queens not by name, but as the womb of our alliance. Romantic, right? But the irony was that after the first few years of marriage, once the political value was sealed by a baby or two, queens were often left to their own devices. Their husbands were usually off doing what medieval men loved best: fighting, hunting, or having affairs. So the queen stayed home, supervising the household, overseeing charity, and serving as a living reminder that the royal family was, technically, still functioning. Let's drift to the 12th century for a moment. The era of Eleanor of Aquitaine. One of the rare queens who actually managed to make her daily life interesting. Eleanor was clever, educated, and breathtakingly rich in her own right. Before she even married King Louis XVII of France, she ruled the vast Duchy of Aquitaine, basically the whole southwest corner of France. But her marriage to Louis was not a fairy tale. Louis was pious, awkward, and, as Eleanor later put it, more monk than man. Their relationship reportedly lacked a certain warmth, or, to put it another way, the only thing they produced during their 15-year marriage was mutual disappointment and 2 daughters. Eleanor spent much of her time traveling with Louis on crusade, which sounds adventurous until you remember that going on crusade involved heat stroke, fleas, and dysentery. By the end, she had enough and managed to get her marriage annulled. Within months, she married Henry Plantagenet, the future Henry II of England. And just like that, Eleanor became Queen of England. Now, you might think that being queen twice would make her life easier. It didn't. She spent most of her time managing estates, arranging her children's marriages, and trying to stop Henry from having tantrums. Eventually, he imprisoned her for years after she sided with her rebellious sons. So, yes, being a queen could be glamorous, but it could also end with you locked in a tower by your husband while your sons fight over the throne. For less powerful queens, life was quieter and narrower. A typical day might start with morning prayers, followed by a light meal of bread and ale. Then came the business of the household, meeting with stewards, approving expenses, writing letters, and listening to petitions from servants or visiting nobles. Every large royal household was an economy in itself. Hundreds of servants, cooks, laundresses, knights, musicians, falconers, all reporting up through the Queen's Chamberlain or her ladies-in-waiting. Running that network smoothly was an achievement. The Queen was expected to embody grace, but also competence. She supervised charitable donations, made sure guests were fed, and sometimes even acted as regent when her husband was away. Queens, like Philippa of Hainaut, wife of Edward III, did this beautifully. She managed the royal finances so well that chroniclers praised her as wise and gentle. She also had 11 children, personally interceded to save prisoners' lives, and still found time to commission tapestries and sponsor musicians. So, yes, Philippa was busy, but she was busy doing the kind of work no one ever wrote songs about. Now, for the queens who didn't have Philippa's temperament or her patience, daily life could be suffocating. Take Isabella of France, wife of Edward II. A French princess, elegant and proud, married off to a king who was more interested in his male favorite, Piers Gaveston, than in her. She spent years being publicly humiliated, sidelined, and ignored. Eventually, she teamed up with her lover, Roger Mortimer, to overthrow her husband. It worked. She became known as the She-Wolf of France, which, in fairness, sounds far more exciting than embroidering saintly scenes in a drafty chamber. But for most queens, rebellion wasn't an option. So they filled their hours with the quiet arts of piety and patience. They embroidered devotional banners, read prayer books, and listened to sermons. They walked in gardens, wrote letters, and occasionally engaged in court gossip, which, in a world without Netflix, was one of the few remaining pleasures. Reading, by the way, was a luxury. Books were rare, handwritten, and expensive. But queens were among the few women in medieval Europe who were consistently literate. Some, like Margaret of Anjou, even kept libraries. Margaret, wife of Henry VI, was known for her sharp intelligence and her sharper tongue. When Henry's mental health collapsed and civil war broke out, she effectively led his faction, commanding armies and negotiating treaties. She was also, by all accounts, deeply unpopular, partly because she had the audacity to act like a king in a woman's body. Medieval chroniclers didn't appreciate that. Still, for every Margaret, there were a dozen quiet queens, whose only recorded achievements were graciously receiving visitors and dying in childbirth. The line between royalty and captivity was often very thin. Let's not forget the religious duties. Queen was expected to model piety for the kingdom, attending Mass daily, fasting during Lent, donating to monasteries, and funding the building of churches. Charitable giving was, in a way, one of the few arenas where queens could exercise personal influence. Many founded hospitals, almshouses, and convents, institutions that bore their names long after their husbands' wars were forgotten. It was also good public relations. Feeding the poor made you seem virtuous. And virtue, in the medieval imagination, was just as valuable as power. But behind the rituals of devotion and duty, queens were also women, often young ones. Many were married off at 14 or 15 to men decades older. Their first pregnancies could begin before they fully understood what was happening. Imagine being a teenager, sent to a foreign country, surrounded by strangers speaking another language, and expected to embody dignity at all times. Then, imagine spending every day under the eyes of courtiers waiting for you to fail. No pressure. One chronicler described a young queen's life as a crown of gold upon a heart of ice. It sounds poetic, but also exhausting. Even recreation was formalized. Hunting, for instance, was one of the few outdoor activities considered appropriate for queens, as long as it was elegant. They hunted smaller game, falcons catching birds, dogs chasing hares. They rode side saddle in ornate gowns that made falling off an especially humiliating experience. When they weren't outdoors, queens might play board games, listen to music, or supervise the education of their children. Music was constant in royal households, harps, lutes, and voices echoing through stone halls. It filled the silence between prayers and politics. There were also festivals and banquets, of course. But even those were work. Queens were expected to sit gracefully through hours of feasting, smiling as jugglers performed and guests drank too much. A royal dinner could last 5 hours, during which a queen might barely eat because her every gesture was watched. Let's drift a little further. In Part 2, we'll slip deeper into their private world. The whispered politics of the bedchamber, the secret letters, the rivalries between queens and mistresses, and the delicate art of surviving a husband with a crown and a temper. Because if you thought the days were restrictive, the nights could be far worse. And when you're ready, we'll continue our quiet walk through the peculiar, melancholy world of Europe's forgotten hangman. How rich people smelled before soap was common. Perfume, powder, and the illusion of cleanliness. Tonight, we're drifting back to a time when cleanliness wasn't exactly next to godliness. It was more like a polite rumor. So, settle in. Dim the lights. Maybe take a deep breath of whatever fresh laundry scent is floating around you. Because by the end of this episode, you'll be very grateful for it. We're heading into the fragrant, filthy world of the pre-modern rich. The kings and queens who believed water was dangerous, perfume was medicinal, and that changing your shirt counted as a bath. It's a world of lace, velvet, and body odor. Of golden bathtubs that were rarely used, and of people who sincerely believed that dirt, when worn properly, was a kind of spiritual armor. Let's begin gently. Somewhere in the 14th or 15th century, Europe smelled. Busy. Not bad exactly. More like a mixture of animals, smoke, incense, and humanity. Cities were crowded. Waste disposal was optimistic at best, and public baths had long been shut down for being morally suspicious. And in this perfectly aromatic environment lived the upper classes, nobles, courtiers, and royals, whose approach to hygiene could be described as decorative avoidance. Because the rich didn't need to be clean, they just needed to look clean. For centuries, water had a complicated reputation. Bathing, especially full-body bathing, was viewed as both decadent and dangerous. Medieval doctors warned that warm water opened the pores, letting disease and sin seep in. The logic wasn't great, but it was persistent, so people stopped washing. Instead, they developed elaborate alternatives. Powdering, perfuming, and occasionally wiping themselves with bits of linen soaked in rose water. What one might call an aromatic illusion of hygiene. If you were wealthy enough, your servants would bring scented gloves, pomanders filled with herbs, and cloths sprinkled with vinegar to dab at your face. It didn't remove dirt, of course, but it did move it around in a very sophisticated way. Now, not everyone stopped bathing completely. Medieval and Renaissance people did still wash, just very selectively. Hands and faces were cleaned daily. Feet, occasionally. everything else, on special occasions, or by accident. Queen Elizabeth Vance, for example, is often quoted as saying she bathed once a month, whether she needed it or not, which sounds like a joke, but may have been perfectly true. Her courtiers were reportedly impressed by how fresh she always seemed. A triumph of perfume and powder over biology. And she wasn't alone. Louis XIV of France, the Sun King himself, famously hated bathing. He took only a handful of baths in his entire life, though he did change his shirt several times a day. In the French court, linen was believed to draw out impurities, so a new shirt was as good as soap. He once told his doctors that water made him faint. Naturally, they agreed. So, instead of washing, Louis bathed in scent. His apartments in Versailles were filled with perfumed fountains, burning incense, and bouquets so large they probably caused mild respiratory distress. He wore gloves soaked in ambergris, a waxy substance from whale intestines that, for reasons no one fully understood, was considered luxurious. Visitors described him as radiant, which may have been polite shorthand for strongly atmospheric. Let's drift a little further back, to the late Middle Ages, a period when being clean meant wearing layers of fine, pale fabric that visibly hid the grime. Laundry was an enormous ordeal, so rich households owned dozens of undergarments and chemises, swapping them out frequently. A clean shirt signaled purity, even if the skin beneath hadn't seen water in weeks. Linen was considered almost magical. People believed it absorbed bad humors and wicked smells from the body. A sort of textile exorcism, so, when you changed your linen, you were literally cleansing your soul. Some took this very seriously. One 15th century German noblewoman wrote that she changed her smock daily, and therefore God would find her pleasing. It's hard to say whether God agreed, but her servants probably appreciated the effort. Perfume, meanwhile, became a status symbol, not just because it smelled nice, but because it was expensive and imported, usually from Venice, or even farther east. Perfume wasn't seen as cosmetic, but medicinal. The logic went like this. Pleasant smells repelled disease. Bad smells carried it. Miasma theory, the belief that illness floated through the air as poisonous vapor, dominated medical thinking. So, if you surrounded yourself with enough rose water, cloves, and civet oil, you were basically bulletproof. It's worth noting that some of these scents were challenging. Civet oil, for example, came from the scent glands of a small cat-like animal. Ambergris came from whales. And musk, that most coveted of base notes, came from the gland of a male musk deer. People were walking around drenched in secretions from 3 continents and feeling incredibly elegant about it. Let's pause for a moment on hair, because hair, too, was a battlefield between cleanliness and social appearance. For noble women, Washing the hair was rare, maybe once or twice a month. Instead, they used dry shampoos made from bran, crushed herbs, or even powdered violets. They'd brush it for hours, perfuming it, braiding it, and occasionally baking lice to death by sitting near the hearth in a linen hood. Men were no better. Wigs, when they appeared in the 17th century, became laboratories of scent and insects. They were dusted with starch, sprinkled with orange blossom water, and sometimes sprayed with vinegar to keep the bugs at bay. When that failed, the lice just adapted and moved in permanently. By the early 1700s, wig maintenance had become an industry. Barbers advertised powders with charming names like Virgin's Breath and Heavenly Snow. In reality, most were mixtures of flour, chalk, and crushed bones, which, if you think about it, made everyone smell like a haunted bakery. Now, you might wonder, if everyone smelled, did anyone notice? And the answer is, not really. Smell is relative. When the entire world smells like wood smoke, horses, and damp wool, one's threshold for unpleasant adjusts. In fact, contemporary letters rarely complain about odor. People just accepted it. The way we accept background noise or traffic today, there are even descriptions of pleasant scents that, to us, sound horrifying. Noblewoman in 1520 praised her husband's earthy musk, likely a poetic way of saying he hadn't bathed since Lent in a society where perfume meant wealth and sweat meant labor. Smelling too clean was suspicious. It suggested idleness, vanity, or worse, that you might be trying to smell like the lower classes, who actually washed in rivers. Public baths did once exist, of course. In the early medieval period, many towns had communal bathhouses, holdovers from the Roman tradition. People went to relax, socialize, and scrub themselves. But over time, the church grew nervous about what exactly people were doing in there. The answer was usually too much. By the 15th century, many bathhouses had acquired reputations as dens of sin. Moralists complained that men and women were bathing together, and that the steam of fleshly temptation was too much for Christian decency. So they were shut down. Cleanliness lost the battle to chastity. From then on, bathing became private, or non-existent. The wealthy simply retreated to their perfumed chambers, wrapped in linen and denial. Let's drift now into one of those chambers. It's the year 1550. Somewhere in France, a noblewoman is preparing for a visit. Her maids bring her a silver basin filled with rose water. She dips her fingers in, dabs her face, and dries it with a square of embroidered linen. Her chemise is freshly laundered. It smells faintly of lavender and smoke. Her hair is dusted with violet powder, her lips tinted with a little red made from crushed cochineal beetles. Around her neck, she wears a pomander, a small metal orb filled with clove, cinnamon, and dried orange peel. By candlelight, she looks radiant. If you were standing in the room, you might even call her luminous, but you wouldn't want to get too close. This wasn't neglect. By the way, this was philosophy. The medieval and early modern elite truly believed that the skin was a sacred barrier. Washing it too often might weaken it or invite illness. There were exceptions. Sweating cures, where nobles sat in hot rooms to purge toxins, were popular during outbreaks of plague. But these were medical treatments. Not hygiene. They didn't bathe to get clean. They bathed to rebalance the humors. When foreigners visited Europe, they sometimes noticed the smell. Gently. Arab travelers in the 12th and 13th centuries wrote about how rarely Europeans bathed, and how strange it was that they covered their bodies in animal grease and flowers instead of soap. One Persian writer described European nobles as people of sweet speech and sour odor. It's an unfair jab, but not an inaccurate one. So, to summarize the situation before we drift into the next scented century, for much of history, the rich did not smell better than the poor. They simply smelled different. Where peasants had the honest aroma of labor and livestock, nobles had the complicated bouquet of ambergris, smoke, and unwashed velvet. We'll meet the perfumers, the powderers, and the royal physicians who swore that soap was heresy. But lavender oil was salvation. So, rest your mind, take a deep, clean breath. And when you're ready, we'll step quietly into the next age of beautiful stench. I hope you will now sleep and enjoy our story, and please like and subscribe my channel. What did executioners do when there were no executions? A quiet profession with an awkward reputation tonight. We're drifting back to a quieter corner of medieval life. Quiet, that is, except for the occasional scream. So, if you're tucked in, lights low, and in the mood for something grimly soothing, we're going to talk about executioners. Those men who were feared, shunned, and, rather awkwardly, necessary. Because, as it turns out, chopping off heads wasn't exactly a full-time gig. Most towns didn't have enough crime or enough criminals to keep an executioner busy all week. So what did they do the rest of the time? Well, quite a lot, actually, and almost all of it was deeply uncomfortable. Let's start with a simple truth. Being an executioner was one of the most socially confusing jobs in Europe. On one hand, they worked directly for the state. They enforced law and order. They were paid by the crown or by the city. And technically, they were doing God's work, removing the wicked from the world. But on the other hand, no one wanted to live near them, or shake their hand, or sit next to them in church. People thought executioners were permanently tainted, polluted by death. In some towns, they had to sit on their own pew. In others, they weren't allowed to enter taverns, and sometimes, when they died, they had to be buried outside the city walls. So imagine, for a moment, being the local hangman. You wake up, you stretch. You've got nothing on the calendar today. No traitors to quarter, no thieves to burn, no witches to drown. But you still have to make a living. You can't exactly moonlight as a children's tutor, can you? So executioners got creative. Some of them ran taverns or butcher shops, a logical choice, since both involved sharp knives and a certain comfort around blood. Others became amateur doctors, bone setters, and surgeons, because, you see, if you've spent years learning to separate body parts, you eventually figure out how to reattach them. In the German states, this was practically an entire career path. By the 16th century, many executioners were moonlighting as unlicensed physicians, treating wounds, boils, and bone fractures. They weren't always good at it, but they were often better than the official barber surgeons who mostly relied on leeches and prayers. People would sneak to an executioner's house under cover of night, begging for medical help, and he'd oblige, for a small fee, of course. He might not have been welcome at church, but his ointments, his poultices, and his slightly mysterious knowledge of anatomy made him very useful indeed. But let's go back a bit. Before the blood and the superstition set in too thickly, the role of executioner evolved slowly, almost reluctantly, across medieval Europe. In early medieval times, punishment was more of a community event. Everyone chipped in. If someone stole a cow, the villagers handled it themselves, sometimes with a rope, sometimes with a rock, occasionally with both. But as towns grew and laws got fancier, someone had to make it official. You couldn't just have random peasants wandering around, swinging axes. The authorities needed someone reliable, someone who would carry out the sentence, calmly, efficiently, and preferably without fainting. And thus, the executioner became a real job. The trouble was, no one actually wanted the job. In most places, the position was given to a criminal who'd been caught. You could choose hang or hang others. Naturally, many chose the latter. That's why so many executioners were former thieves or murderers themselves. They knew the system intimately. They also knew that one mistake on the scaffold could put them right back in the noose. In some towns, the position was hereditary. The father was the hangman, so the son would be too. Not because the boy particularly wanted to spend his life decapitating strangers, but because no one else would marry into the family. And so the profession lingered, generation after generation. One German family, the Franz Schmidts of Nuremberg, became almost legendary for this. Franz Schmidt, who served as executioner in the late 1500s, kept a meticulous diary. Over his career, he executed 361 people. But he also treated hundreds of patients for wounds, infections, and broken bones. He wasn't proud of his role exactly, but he saw it as a kind of civic duty, a job that had to be done by someone, and as long as he did it cleanly and mercifully, he believed he could die with a clear conscience. Let's drift now into one of those odd, quiet days when Schmidt had nothing on his calendar. No thieves, no witches, no aristocrats caught saying unwise things about the Duke. Just a Thursday. He might have gone out into town to buy supplies, but not too far. The townspeople would move aside when they saw him coming. Mothers would nudge their children to the other side of the street. Some might even cross themselves, as though he were a walking bad omen. He'd probably stop by the local tavern he ran, checking on the barrels of ale. Maybe his wife handled most of the customers. Respectable people preferred not to drink directly from the hangman's hand. Then, perhaps, a knock at the back door. Someone's servant, whispering urgently. A nobleman's son had broken his leg during a hunt. Could the Meister come quickly? And so Schmidt would pack his tools, knives, ointments, herbs and bandages, and go save a man's life. By nightfall, that same nobleman's family would likely refuse to eat in the same room as him. Such was the peculiar, circular logic of medieval society. You could be essential, and yet untouchable. Now, not all executioners lived such orderly lives. Many were notorious for drinking, gambling, and other vices. If you spend your days decapitating people, one might forgive you for needing a stiff drink afterward. In Paris, the office of executioner was famous, almost glamorous in its own dreadful way. The title belonged to the Monsieur de Paris, who carried out royal sentences on behalf of the crown. It was a hereditary post, passed down through the Sanson family for over a century. The Sansons were almost celebrities. They executed Louis XIII, among others. But even they were treated as social outcasts, invited to grand events one day, shunned from polite company the next. It was, in every sense, a career of contradictions. When business was really slow, some executioners found other creative uses for their skills. They disposed of animal carcasses, for instance. Cities often hired them to clean up dead horses or stray dogs. Others worked as public torturers, carrying out interrogations or punishments short of death. Whipping, branding, mutilations. It was all technically law enforcement, but not exactly the kind you'd want to see on your resume. There were also perks, if one can call them that. Executioners often received free housing, usually near the city gate or outside the walls. They had access to certain goods confiscated from criminals, clothes, tools, even furniture, and in some regions they were allowed to claim parts of the executed body for profit, which sounds horrifying until you realize that bones, fat, and even bits of rope from hangings were considered medicinal. People believed that touching the hand of an executed man could cure illness, that drinking powdered skull could stop nosebleeds, and that the fat of a hanged man, yes, really, made an excellent salve for joint pain. Naturally, the executioner became the supplier of these dubious remedies. He'd sell them discreetly, of course, but business, as they say, was brisk. So, when there were no executions, the hangman was still busy. Busy healing, or brewing, or mixing, or selling. Always just at the edge of what society needed, but never within its embrace. And yet, despite the stigma, some executioners were genuinely respected. They were skilled, practical men. They knew how to cut cleanly, how to make death swift. They treated their craft, as grim as it was, with professionalism. A badly done execution was a scandal. It made crowds restless. It made authorities look foolish. So a good executioner, reliable and discreet, was quietly valued, even if no one would admit it. And yet, despite all that scrutiny, many queens left surprisingly little behind. Their letters, portraits, and personal thoughts were often destroyed, overwritten by chronicles focused on their husbands. Even their names blurred together. Isabella's, Margaret's, and Eleanor's, endlessly repeated. To be a queen was to be visible, but not seen. Famous, but voiceless. The irony, of course, is that many of them quietly shaped the world more than anyone realized. Through marriages, alliances, and patronage, queens influenced art, politics, and religion, even if chroniclers preferred to attribute their accomplishments to men. So, what did queens do all day? They waited. They prayed. They managed, mediated, endured, and occasionally rebelled. They lived lives of immense privilege and immense constraint. Their daily routines were filled with symbols of power, but very little actual power. And yet, in their stillness, they held kingdoms together. They maintained the illusion of stability, while the men around them burned everything down. That, perhaps, was the quiet genius of medieval queenship, to reign without ruling, to endure without acknowledgement, and to be remembered, faintly, centuries later, mostly for the dresses they wore and the sons they produced. We'll pause here, before things get even stranger. We'll look at their families, their children, and the bizarre rituals that govern their lives. When to speak, where to sit, and how to carry the weight of death, day after day. So, settle back. Take a slow breath. The secret lives of medieval nuns who didn't want to be there. Silent walls, noisy secrets tonight. We're drifting back to a quieter century, one of echoing stone halls, candlelight, and vows that were, let's say, not always voluntary, So, settle in. Dim the lights, and let's talk about the women who were sent to live out their days behind convent walls, often against their will, and what exactly they did once the doors shut behind them. Because while the image of a medieval nun might bring to mind serene chanting and spotless virtue, the truth is far more human, and often far more chaotic. For centuries, Europe's nobility had a simple system for dealing with surplus daughters. If your eldest girl could marry well, perfect. That's one alliance secured. But what about the others? The ones who were plain, inconveniently opinionated, or simply too expensive to marry off? The solution was as elegant as it was cruel. You sent them to God. Convents across medieval Europe were full of young women who hadn't chosen to be there. Some were as young as 12, barely old enough to read their Latin psalms. Many were second or third daughters of noble families, packed off to the cloister like unwanted heirlooms. They took vows of poverty, chastity, and obedience, but not all of them took those vows seriously. Let's start with the basics. A convent in medieval Europe was, in theory, a holy place, a community of women devoted to prayer, contemplation, and service. They rose at dawn to chant the divine offices. They spent hours copying manuscripts, making herbal medicines or weaving cloth. They ate simple meals, rarely spoke during the day, and spent long evenings in quiet reflection. At least, that's what the rulebook said. In reality, many convents functioned like miniature courts, especially the rich ones. They were filled with noble women who had no interest in poverty, and who brought with them servants, jewels, and family drama. Abbesses, the women in charge, could wield considerable power. They managed estates, lent money, and received visits from bishops and princes. Some abbesses ruled over more wealth than a local baron, which might explain why so many families were eager to dedicate their daughters to God. It was cheaper than a dowry, and occasionally more profitable. Now, not every nun was unhappy. Some truly believed in their calling. For many women, the convent offered safety, a refuge from violent marriages or childbirth. It could even mean education, something few women outside the church ever received. But others, well, they treated the convent less like a holy retreat and more like a particularly inconvenient boarding school. The records are full of complaints from bishops about nuns who wore bright clothes, refused to stay inside the cloister, and spent their evenings gossiping at the windows with passing men. One bishop in England, in the 13th century, wrote that the nuns of his diocese were given to vanity and fond of idle amusements, which, coming from a medieval bishop, meant they were probably having a fairly good time. Some convents were notorious for it. The Aïdouitou Abbey of Saint-Cyr in France was described in one inspection, report as a den of luxury and disobedience. The Safibil nuns there held elaborate feasts, kept pet dogs, and allegedly maintained secret passageways for their male visitors. In Italy, the convent of San Zaccaria in Venice was one of the city's wealthiest religious houses. Its nuns were all from noble families, which meant that, of course, they refused to behave like humble servants of God. They wore silk veils, gold jewelry, and perfume imported from the East. Their rooms were decorated with tapestries, not crucifixes. They held music performances and hosted banquets for visiting dignitaries. One observer, visiting in the late 15th century, described it as less a convent than a palace, with prayers as its excuse. Let's drift now into the daily rhythm of one of these reluctant nuns. Picture her, a young woman named perhaps Isolde or Beatrix. She's 20, well-born, and extremely bored. She didn't choose this life. Her father decided one morning that her dowry would be better spent reinforcing the family's estate walls. So off she went, bundled into a carriage, tears in her eyes, to the convent of St. Mildred, or some equally saintly name. The first few months were miserable. The hours were long. The food was terrible. The prayers seemed endless, and the silence unbearable. But soon she started to learn how things really worked. The abbess had her own suite of rooms, complete with a fireplace and feather bed. Certain special guests were allowed in after vespers, and the porteress, the nun guarding the gate, could be bribed with sugared almonds to open it just a little wider. There were even local merchants who delivered wine, discreetly in barrels labeled as holy water, and so life began to look a little less bleak. To modern ears, this might sound scandalous, but to the medieval mind, it was mostly inconvenient. The Church, naturally, issued endless reforms to crack down on wayward sisters. But there were so many convents, and so many noble families protecting their daughters, that true discipline was rare. When an abbess misbehaved, she might be quietly replaced, but rarely punished. After all, she probably came from a family with knights and castles, and, as for the younger nuns, the so-called black sheep, their rebellions were often small and domestic, sneaking out to visit relatives, wearing lace under their habits, passing love letters. To the monks in neighboring monasteries, it was sin, yes, but it was also survival, a small grasp at freedom in a life chosen for them. There's one rather perfect example from France in the 14th century. At the Abbey of Sainte-Croix in Poitiers, a group of young nuns, including some daughters of the highest nobility, decided that the rule of silence was, frankly, overrated. They started holding secret parties in the dormitory, complete with food, singing, and a smuggled lute. When the abbess tried to stop them, they locked her in her room. Eventually, the bishop intervened. He arrived expecting to find solemn repentance, and instead found the nuns drinking wine and arguing theology. It took weeks to restore order, and even then, most of the culprits simply got transferred to other convents, because, as one chronicler sighed, they were young and of good birth. In other words, untouchable. Let's pause for a moment on what these convents actually looked like. They weren't all gloomy stone boxes echoing with chants. Some were surprisingly comfortable. Lush gardens, private chapels, painted walls. The sisters might tend bees, make rosewater, or cultivate herbs for medicine. There was beauty in the rhythm of it all. Prayer, work, quiet. And for some women, that beauty became a real calling. There were saints among them, mystics and poets. Hildegard of Bingen, for instance, a brilliant abbess, composer, and theologian of the 12th century. She saw visions, wrote treatises on natural science, and even corresponded with emperors. But she was the exception. For every Hildegard, there were dozens of bored Isoldes, carving initials into their prayer benches and wondering what life might have been if their fathers had chosen differently. And yet, even within confinement, some found ways to express themselves. They painted manuscripts, embroidered altar cloths, or wrote poems that were half prayer, half confession. Their art survives, full of longing, wit, and a quiet defiance that still hums through the centuries. One anonymous nun wrote, in a 15th century manuscript, "I am enclosed, but my thoughts walk freely in the garden of the world." It's a lovely line, and also a small act of rebellion. Of course, not all rebellion was poetic. Some was distinctly physical. There were affairs, sometimes with priests, sometimes with monks, occasionally with local laymen who found the idea of a forbidden love irresistible. Records from ecclesiastical courts are filled with scandalous cases, pregnancies, secret births, and desperate cover-ups. In one German convent, a young nun gave birth and tried to hide the baby in the laundry. The scandal rocked the town for months, but she wasn't executed or even expelled, just quietly transferred and replaced by another unwilling girl. Medieval society had an extraordinary talent for pretending things weren't happening. So, to summarize the situation, slowly, softly, before we drift onward. Medieval convents were supposed to be sanctuaries of peace, but behind their quiet walls, life was messy, human, and sometimes gloriously unholy. Some nuns found peace and purpose, others found loopholes, and a great many simply tried to get through the day without going mad from boredom or candle smoke. By contrast, in the Islamic world, bathing remained a sacred duty, both physical and spiritual. Soap-making flourished in places like Aleppo, Damascus, and Cordoba, using olive oil and lye. These soaps were exported widely, though Europeans often treated them as luxury goods, not necessities. There's even a record of Charlemagne receiving soap as a royal gift, which tells you how unusual washing had become. To put it simply, in Europe, soap was exotic. In the Middle East, it was Tuesday, and to them, that was prestige. In the next part, we'll wander deeper into this strange half-world, where nuns became power brokers, mystics, and even political pawns. We'll look at what happened when kings tried to interfere, how some convents became family businesses, and how women behind walls quietly shaped the world beyond them. So, for now, rest your eyes, take a slow breath, and when you're ready, we'll step softly into the next cloister.